All right. Um, Welcome, everyone. My name is Nate Sims. I'm very happy to be here to give this presentation, Introduction to the Erma or Qiang language. So kind of a roadmap of what I'd like to cover in this presentation is to give an introduction to the speakers of this language, some discussion of the sociolinguistic situation for the people who speak it, and then the rest of the time to talk a little bit about the structure of the language itself. So we'll discuss a bit of the phonology, the sound system of the language, covering briefly the consonants, the vowels, what is the nature of the syllable in the language, and also the role of tone in the language. And then after that, to talk a little bit about the larger structures. Some of the more interesting structures of the language are the verbs and the verbal morphology. So we'll talk a bit about the spatial prefixes, a little bit about this idea of associated motion, and to give you not a full account of the verbs, but just an appreciation for this kind of intricate and complicated part of the language. There's not as much to say about the nouns, and so we'll talk a bit about the verbs. Okay, so Erma, the Erma language is also called Qiang. I'll talk about that here in a minute, but it's part of the Trans-Himalayan language family, meaning that it is related to Chinese, to Tibetan, and also to Burmese. Those are probably the major languages that maybe some of you all are familiar with. And within that family tree, it's probably closest related to Burmese. I think it's not definitive yet. There's still some work being done in the history of the language, but probably fair to say that of those three major languages, it's closest related to Burmese. So it's spoken within what is now Sichuan province in the People's Republic of China, principally along the Min River. So we see this arrow here on the screen. Let's see if I can do this mouse. Okay, yeah, so up along the Min River, in between, kind of wedged in between the Sichuan Basin and the Tibetan Plateau. So we'll talk a little bit more about the situation for the language. There are probably about 100,000 speakers of the language. It's hard to gauge exactly, but I think that's a fair estimate. So it's a relatively large number of speakers. And there's some issues worth discussing about who the people are that speak this language. So there's a Chinese term, Qiang, spelled Q-I-A-N-G, with this character here to the left. And this is a very old term. So even in some of the earliest Chinese writings, this ethnonym occurs, and it probably meant anyone to the west of Chinese territorial control at that time. So another term is the Western Qiang. And this term is very old. It probably was more broadly used for different peoples in the Western regions. And with the founding of the People's Republic of China, there came to be a classification of all the peoples within China, and it was fixed at 56 different ethnicities. And so Qiang is one of these 56 different ethnicities. Erma is the term that Qiang people call themselves, or a variant of this word. Sometimes it's ma, sometimes mer, sometimes Erma or Jme. There's many different dialectal variants, but Erma is kind of used to encompass all of these different terms that people call themselves. Traditionally, they were agriculturalists who lived in these kind of deep valleys along the Min River. So they're not pastoralists, although some people kept yaks and goats and still do today, but mostly subsistence agriculturalists. And there's a kind of split within the people who speak the Erma language between those that are classified by the Chinese government as Qiang and those that are classified by the Chinese government as Tibetan. And this is primarily has to do with religion. So the people who follow Tibetan Buddhism closer to the Tibetan Plateau in the Northwest have been designated Tibetans, and the people who are non-Buddhists or animists or shamanists in the Southeast are the Qiang nationality. So it's something of a kind of India-Pakistan situation for this split. So, you know, people have different ideas. Some people who are Tibetan ethnicity, they recognize that, oh, we speak the same language as the Qiang people next door to us. And some people say, actually, no, that's a separate language. So it's a very kind of contentious issue that you can find varying opinions on all sides of this, but primarily a split between about half of the speakers who are considered Tibetan, half of them are considered Qiang. In any case, the language is endangered because of increasing influence of mainly Mandarin. So there's extensive bilingualism with Mandarin. I've been, you know, going to this area for some time and been involved with Qiang language and Urma language documentation since about 2006. And most everyone I've met speaks some level of Chinese. So Chinese is really gaining in popularity in Qiang, where Urma is on the decline generally. There's some writings for people who are interested by an anthropologist named Wang Ming-ke, who has written about the history of this kind of contentious designation of people as either Tibetan or Qiang ethnicity. So here on the map on the screen, we see Sichuan province outlined, and then in the yellow region, this is the Aba prefecture of Sichuan province in the northwest. The red area here is Mao County. That's where the majority of Qiang ethnicity Urma speakers live. It's kind of the most condensed place where people live that speak Qiang. So today we'll be talking about one dialect within Mao County, which is the Yonghe Township dialect. So I have kind of the structure of Yonghe Township within Mao County, within the prefecture in Sichuan province here at the bottom. This is kind of just to give an idea of what is around this area. It's a very nice graphic from Gongxun, a person who's worked on the Jiarongic languages in Sichuan. And so you see Qiang here towards the southeast, neighboring the Jiarong languages, and also Amdo-Tibetan to the north, and then Chinese to the south. So this graph is also nice because it illustrates that there's been a lot of work done on the neighboring languages in terms of their internal structure and subgrouping, but not so much on Qiang. So there's really not as much that we can say for certain about the dialect situation. But here's a rough introduction to the dialects of Urma. So we have in this red circle what is typically called Northern Urma, and within this circle, the dialects are pretty homogeneous. People can understand each other if they're well-intentioned within this area generally. Maybe at the borders, the extreme edges, maybe not so much, but it's thought to be kind of a later expansion historically because it's more internally homogeneous. Outside of this, you see the blue circles are what is called Southern Urma, and they're less internally homogeneous. So people from these different areas within the blue circles may or may not be able to communicate effectively with each other in Urma. And most of the time they would use Chinese as a language to communicate with each other. This yellow line here shows the division between where people to the northwest are considered Tibetan, and to the southeast of that yellow line considered Qiang. And so we see that the ethnic boundary is one that it corresponds with the county line, but not necessarily with the dialectal division. So today we'll be talking about the Yonghe dialect, which is the dialect I've done the most research on and have been friends with speakers of this dialect for some time now. It's the easternmost dialect of Urma, so it's interesting in that respect and hasn't really been studied as much as some of the northwestern dialects. So this is just a picture of my friend's grandmother, whose family has taught me about Qiang. I went to Chinese public school, and in middle school became friends with my friend his family spoke Yonghe Qiang or Yonghe Urma. And this is the traditional attire for women in this area. It's unique to this valley. So we might imagine in another political context that it would be considered maybe its own language, or that these people would be considered a separate ethnicity. You know, they only really identify with other people from the valley, and not so much with the other Irma-speaking peoples. So it's a unique kind of subculture within Mao County is this the Yonghe Valley. To give an idea just about a little bit more about the sociolinguistic situation, I have this map here with the help of Google. So the red dots here represent villages within the Yonghe Valley where Irma is no longer spoken by either old people or young people, just people who speak Chinese exclusively. The yellow or orange circles here represent villages where Irma is still spoken, but not by children. So only in these kind of far north, more remote villages represented with the orange triangles do you see places where Irma is still spoken by children, it's still being acquired and used more in daily life. So you see this is kind of a microcosm for the whole area in that Qiang or Irma language use is on the decline and being replaced with Chinese. It's also the case that the more remote villages are more economically challenged. And so there's a negative connotation or a stereotype sometimes with people who speak Irma as being, you know, having less access to education and being backwards in some way. So it also contributes to the decline of the language, and that situation is rather unfortunate, but that's the case for the Yonghe Valley in many ways. All right, so let's talk about the structure of this particular dialect. All I'm going to say is, you know, restricted to just this one dialect, although there's some similarities with others. So we'll start with looking at the consonants for this dialect. We see there are a large number of consonants with different consonants at many places of articulation. So bilabial, alveolar, retroflex, palatal, velar, and glottal. A large number of fricatives, which is somewhat typologically unusual, but not necessarily for this region. So we'll just talk a little bit about this this three-way distinction for the obstruents. So the distinction here between ba pa ba, da ta da, and for the velars ga ka ga. For the affricates, you have a parallel distinction: za ta za, ja cha ja, and ja cha ja. So this is this three-way distinction that's found in most Irma dialects. What's noteworthy here is actually the absence of uvular sounds. Uvular sounds like ka and ka are found in a lot of the neighboring dialects, but not in this dialect. So my suspicion is that that's a kind of influence of Chinese and that this is a loss in this dialect. So we see a fairly robust consonant inventory with these three-way voicing distinctions. Okay. For the vowels, you have a somewhat asymmetrical vowel system, 8 different vowels, with the primary vowel distinction being between the front vowels and the back vowels. So the front 4 vowels and the back 4 vowels. And we see this kind of pattern happen where vowels will change depending on their environment, called vowel harmony. And so we might see for this front-back vowel assimilation for the vowels, where we have in the first form here, the verb is ya, to be good. If someone were to say still good, there's a continuative aspect prefix which marks continuation of that state. So da ya, still good. If we say need, ji, da ji, still needs, or ye, to live, da ye, and then chu, to pick, da chu. So these all have this front vowel a. For the back vowels, for verbs that start with a back vowel, like ne, lodi, wu, and lade, we have the back vowel on the prefix. So da ne, da lodi, da wu, and da lade. So this is an area of interest in the language that the vowels change, especially for the prefixes, depending on the vowel of the verb stem. So this is the continuative aspect prefix. We'll talk a little bit more about the verbs here in a minute. But going back to the sound structure, this is the layout for the syllable structures that we find in the language. It's relatively simple and straightforward. We have 5 different types of syllables. The first type, consonant vowel, so this verb ha, to be free, or to be leisurely. Number 2, you can have a consonant, a glide, and then a vowel, so hua, to sell. We can have some instances where we have closed syllables, but only in rare instances that are actually, in all cases, borrowings from Chinese, where you can have a nasal coda to the syllable, han ta, to call someone, and then huan ta, to change. So these are borrowings from Chinese han and huan. You can also have a consonant coda, which is a glide, and only in some derived cases. So this verb hua, to sell, if there's a certain evidential marking that comes at the end of the verb, then you would say huai, something like, it marks degree of certainty, but it's the same verb with a glide coda. So this is actually simple consonant inventory, or a syllable template compared to a language like Tibetan or some of the Jiarhongic languages, which have very large inventories of possible syllables. So what's the reason for this? Mostly simplification. So we see, if we compare Yonghe with other Erma dialects, we see that they've lost the complex onsets. So we have the shpe type onsets from Ronghong, which is more conservative. Those correlate with the he fricative onset in Yonghe. So shpie, fa, shpe, fe, shpa, far, and so on. And then the voiced complex onsets in Ronghong correspond with the voiced counterpart in Yonghe. So zhbe corresponds with ver, zhbu corresponds with vur. So there's a reduction in complexity that has led to this kind of simple syllable template. We see also with the loss of codas. So there's only open syllables in the language. If we compare it with a language like Tibetan, which preserves the consonant codas of earlier stages, we see that these have been lost in Yonghe in a predictable way. So for these, the last 4 words on in this table, the Tibetan forms and the pre-Tibetan forms have K as the coda, and this has been lost in Yonghe, and with the reflex of a rising tone. So certain syllable types that were complex have become more simple, but there's been a compensatory development of a tonal contrast. So we see a high tone for these first 4 words in Yonghe that have no obstruent codas in Tibetan. And then for the last 4 words, we have the K coda in Tibetan. And this corresponds with a rising tone in Yonghe. So I think there's more work to be done on this to say for certain, but there's kind of promising line of inquiry to see, okay, where have the codas been lost and what is the influence of those on the syllables. Okay. All right, so we still have some time to talk about the verb, and it's typologically an agglutinative language. So you find strings of affixes, both prefixes and suffixes that come on either side of the verb stem, which add meaning to the verb. So we have the stem here, would be this core part of the verb. We can have up to 3 prefixes, an orientational or spatial marking prefix, a negative prefix, the continuative aspect prefix, which we've already seen, and a set of suffixes as well, which I probably won't have time to talk about. So we'll talk mostly about the prefixes here. Although there's the causative marking suffix, an associated motion suffix, so it adds an element of motion, come or go, essentially, to the verb. There's an applicative marking suffix, which adds an argument to the verb. So instead of to do something versus to do something for someone. So that would be the difference of the applicative. And then there's person marking and evidential marking, which we won't discuss today. Okay, so let's take the first category of the verb, which are these orientational prefixes. And within that category, there are 8 different markers. So we have da, upwards, downwards, na, upriver, sa, downriver, inwards, ha, outwards, z, towards, and da, away. So these are organized into 4 different axes, having to do with up, down, up or down river, containment, and then towards and away. So some verbs, the prefixes, again, we see this issue of vowel harmony. So the prefix form will change depending on the verb as well. So that was the case for the continuative aspect prefixes, and also for these, this is just the inwards prefix. When it occurs with different verbs, there's up to 5 different vowel qualities that the verb can have. And so one of the interesting things about this use of the orientational prefixes is that it's similar to in English, we have phrasal verbs like listen up or quiet down. So the analogy here would be, it's as if you know, the language has that kind of tendency to use direction with the verbs, but then it kind of went totally bananas and just became totally obligatory, where every verb has a specific direction that it occurs with in different aspects. So it's something that has to be learned when you learn the language. Okay, to listen or to hear, that takes the inwards prefix. So some of them are intuitive and some of them are not so intuitive and just have to be learned. Okay, so with some verbs, they can take all 8 different directions. So this motion verb like fly, in the past tense, what's effectively the past tense, it has to take a prefix and it has to take one of these 8. So flew up, flew down, or so on. And then for some verbs, the verb can't take all of the prefixes, but can take a subset of those. So we see these cases are somewhat interesting, these antonymic pairs. So 得于 to stand upright, 得于 to stand something upside down. Sometimes they're less intuitive or more, they need to be learned. So you have a pair like 打吧, which is the upwards prefix. It means to bloom of a flower. And then 阿吧, the downwards prefix, means for the stars to come out at night. So there's some connection there, but the difference in prefix actually gives a different meaning to the verb. Somewhat like English, listen in versus listen up. You might think of it that way. So we have a verb like gu, when it's used with the upwards prefix, means to win, and with the downwards prefix means to lose. So there's some metaphorical import of these prefixes. And then something like zda, to say, with the upwards prefix dazda, to tell someone, azda, downwards prefix, to explain. So there's kind of a top to bottom metaphor there as well, to talk down to someone or to explain to them. So this is a very kind of complex element of the language, not only because you have to learn which prefix goes with which verb, but also what the pattern is for changing the vowel of the prefix depending on the verb. So it's kind of the key issue if you were to set out to learn to speak Erma, would be figuring out these prefixes. Let's see, so I have some time here to talk about some of the more complex verbs. Now that we have some idea of what the different components of them are, we can talk about some of these maximally complex verbs, which would correspond to kind of sentences in English. So we have in number 1, this sentence, so you haven't yet gone to wipe it down for them. And this would be Amada made giwonyasa. Okay, this is from a text, and so a is the downwards directional prefix, ma is the negative prefix, da is the yet, contributes the yet meaning, made is the stem, meaning to wipe, gi is a verbal suffix, which means go, wu to do something for someone, so you haven't gone to wipe it down for them yet. And then ni is the second person marker. So all of this meaning condensed into one verb. There's a particle at the end, which is kind of more of an attitudinal particle. So you haven't done it yet. And then we have in number 2, this sentence, a mother had not yet gone to bring down the pig foot. So badjubai madajugi. So here we see this prefixal string. What I wanted to point out in this example, we have the same set of prefixes, e, me, da, direction marker down, negative marker, continuative aspect, and then the verb stem bring. But the entire string of prefixes, e, me, da, and amada from the first ones, they all vary because of the verb, because of the vowel of the verb stem. The first vowel of the verb stem in the first example is a, and so all of the prefixes harmonize with that. And then for the second example, we see all of the prefixes em, da harmonizing with this front vowel ju, or this front vowel u. There's kind of a split in the verb of the language where the prefixes behave one way and the suffixes behave another way. So there's no vowel harmony for the suffixes. We see this ki occurs after the front vowel. Here, I guess this is also a front vowel, but there's the suffix yi to go never undergoes any alternation. Neither do any of the other suffixes. So it's kind of the prefixes go together with the stem, and then the suffixes are kind of tacked onto that. Oftentimes the stem will have the first high tone in the word, so it's kind of demarcated in that way, where all the prefixes will be low up until the stem, and then the suffixes are actually more variable, so sometimes the suffixes can have high tone or low tone, but the prefixes tend to operate as a unit. So okay. One other thing to mention here is the relationship between the orientational prefixes and the suffix go, right? So in the example of the pigfoot, it's not that this direction orientational marker down applies to the motion of going. So the mother didn't go down to get the pigfoot. She brought down the pigfoot and she went to go bring down the pigfoot. And this example is from a story. In Qiang traditional households, pig feet and other cured meats are stored on the top level of the house and hung from the rafters. So the mother would have actually gone up from the living room to go get the pigfoot. And so this scope of the orientational markers doesn't really apply beyond the stem. So there's kind of what I'm getting at is a clear demarcation of the stems and the prefixes go together, and then the suffixes behave differently. So in this case, she would have gone up to go bring down the pigfoot. And so the downwards marker here refers to the action of bringing it down, but not the going. Okay, so yes, this is these are some the more complicated verb examples from the language. Not all verbs are this complex, but this is kind of the maximal complexity. So very different from Chinese, and also quite different from Tibetan, which has some agglutinative tendencies, but not as much as Urma. So hopefully I've given people an overview of the people who speak the language, and then some of the structure of the language. So I think that is all I have prepared for today, and would like to thank you all for your time and express my gratitude to my friends from the Yonghe Valley for sharing their language and their time with me over the years. It's been a great privilege to be able to study this language. So I think that's all I'll say for now.